All right. Last week we talked about the first acts of violence in the Bible, and we're kind of still working with this working definition of violence as that which opposes God's will, that which defies God's sovereignty. And so today I'd like to look at the story of Noah. Often it is called Noah and the flood or something like that, but using the word flood is kind of misleading because it is not it's not so much a flood as it is the undoing of creation, the allowing of the forces of chaos to resume their original place. And we'll see that as we move through here. So we're pretty much going to be looking at chapters 6 through 9 today. Maybe even stopping with sort of chapter at end of chapter 8, beginning in chapter 9. There is another conversation that we could have about the source theory, like we did with the Genesis 1 and 2, that this story of Noah can be pulled apart, and we can see the two different stories that have kind of been mashed together to create the one story that we have now. One of them is written by the J source, the person who uses Yahweh to refer to God. And the other one is the priestly source that we talked about, was focused on the ritualization of life and explaining where our rituals and religious practices come from and why they're important. But I think that task could be saved for another time, because I think the final version of this story as we have it today, after the very last editor, whoever that was, put the two stories together and kind of chunked it up and laid them out in the order that they are laid out, is attempting to tell us something, to use this story to tell us something about God, tell us something about who we are. And so I think it would behoove us to kind of look at it as a whole, rather than pulling it apart into the two stories that are present there. But there are, as you read through carefully, you can see that there are some places where situations are repeated, descriptions are repeated twice, or even sometimes there are contradictory pieces of information about how the story unfolds and times, how long the flood lasts, things like that. But that none of that is really pertinent to our conversation for today, so we'll kind of move past that. As I was working on this, I was thinking about, at first I was thinking about that question that I've asked in the past about the perception of violence. So does it matter if the person who is acting doesn't intend to do violence, if the person on the receiving end of that action experiences that act as violent? And I started thinking about situations in which the interpreter, the person being acted on, who feels that violence is being done, it is, at least from our perspective, incorrect in their interpretation. I was thinking about parents and how they sometimes have to do things to or with their children that the children experience as violent. And I'm not talking about, physical or emotional abuse. I'm talking about, you're going to sit at this table until you finish those green beans. I don't care how long it takes. Or I'm talking about Yes, I've got to get that splinter out of your finger so that it doesn't get infected. I'm sorry that it's hurting you as I dig with the tweezers, but it's got to be done. I'm doing this because I love you. It's for your own good. So are those situations violent because the child experiences them as violent? Or is it possible for the person receiving the act to misinterpret the intention of the action, and therefore it can be understood as not violent, even though the person who is experiencing it as violent is experiencing it that way? So there's a possibility that, you know, if we use that metaphor of God as the parent and us as the children who don't have all the information, who don't understand, um, that that medicine that we really, really don't want to take and keep gagging on is going to help us feel better, then that's a possible way to, you know, perhaps explain or explain away some of the violence that we see in the Bible, possibly. But there are, of course, like I mentioned, sometimes that parents do act in anger. They sometimes try to convince themselves and their children that what they are doing is out of love, but it's not. When I was a kid, my parents were divorced, but my father believed in spanking. And I could always tell, typically it was my sister that got the spankings because I was really smart and figured out very quickly how to get away with it and not get caught and get into trouble. But I could tell very quickly when he was in control of himself and when he felt that he was doling out the punishment in a calm and, you know, and logical manner, and when he was legitimately angry. I remember a time when he was so mad at my sister that he lifted her up in the air by the arm and was swatting at her behind as she dangled in the air. And that terrified me. I still remember that to this day because it was such a moment of fear, visceral fear for me. And so how do we differentiate those things when we're talking about God, whose will we cannot understand, whose positions on things we cannot comprehend? And so those are kind of some of the pre-study thoughts that I had as I started to work on our notes for today. But then I picked up my book and I started reading about what the author of our Violence in the Bible book that we're kind of working through had to say about this. And she says that when we are reading stories, especially stories from the very earliest chapters of Genesis, we are looking at what is often termed the primeval period, the prehistorical period, the stories that occur before there is any reference to time or any attempt to locate the stories historically in terms of physical location or time. So there's not a when so and so was king of whatever country this happened. None of that is in there. There's not an attempt to make it historical. And talks about the contrast of the purpose of these types of genres, these types of stories. She uses the word myth and for these early chapters 1 through 11, and not in a negative sense, you know, myth versus fact, but in a sense that it is a particular genre. A myth is a story that attempts to explain the origins of certain aspects of the world, certain experiences that humans have. It's often filled with symbolism and references to common experiences or common phenomena, especially those that are difficult for the people at the time to understand what they are and how they work. Things that, you know, would be considered magical, perhaps. So, you know, we get rainbows, we get stories about stars. Where did our stars come from? Stories about great heroes who were flung into the sky to be remembered forever, things like that. And so we're trying to link ordinary experiences to the paradigm of that experience, to the original instance of that experience, to give it deeper meaning than the ordinary experience might seem to have on its face, to help us to understand why things are the way they are. And so if that is the case, then what is it about us? What is it about our human experience that this story is attempting to describe to us? And that's something that we'll want to keep in mind as we move through this story. Most of the time, we kind of take the assumption that this story is about God punishing, or God getting frustrated and deciding to start over. But perhaps, and the author of this book suggests that it might actually be about something else entirely. So with that, I want to kind of do what we did last time and just kind of jump through these chapters together and take a look at some of what's going on. I've made some notes. If you had a chance to pre-read and have any notes of your own, I'd love to hear your thoughts as we move through. Any questions or thoughts in general before we hop into the text itself? Nope. Okay. So I'd like to start with the beginning of chapter 6. This is chapter 6, verses 1 through 8 is one of the kind of introductions to the story. And then first starting with verse 9 is a new introduction from the other source. But I find verses 1 through 8 to be really interesting. We start the story with this strange thing about giants and sons of God and the heroes of old and all of this. And when my children were small, because we were a clergy family, when they were born, we had at least 8 or 9 or 10 different children's books that were the story of Noah. Those are very easy to come by, and people would gift them to us because they thought, hey, it's a Bible story and they're Bible people, so why don't we give them this? And so we had all these different versions. And we did not have anything about these giants and all of this in the story, and it's completely skipped all of this part, and for obvious reasons. But I think we also tend to skip this part when we're reading, when we're thinking about this story. But I think there are important points to be lifted up here. In chapter 6, verse 2, it talks about how these sons of God, whoever they are, whatever they are, nobody's really sure. Some people think that they are fallen angels. Others think that they are some other kind of humanoid, creation, species. Some people think that they are referring to the time when Neanderthals and Homo sapiens existed on Earth at the same time. Lots of different theories and funny thoughts about this. But I'm not sure that it matters as much exactly who the sons of God are, so much as it matters that, once again, just like in chapters 3 and 4, these creations are stepping out of their place in how God has ordered the world. They are taking upon themselves their own authority, their own sovereignty to make their own choices. And so God has to try to adjust to this, figure out how to handle this. The book that I'm looking at made an interesting point that there at the very end of verse 4, my version says, these were the heroes that were of old, warriors of renown. And the literal Hebrew that is used to describe these people are that they are men of the name, that they have a name. And it is a reference back to, to make a name for them, or forward to the story of the Tower of Babel, where they want to make a name for themselves. They want to build their own meaning, their own purpose, their own fame based on their own actions and their own decisions, rather than leaning on God to find that meaning and purpose for their lives. And the irony is, of course, that they are men of the name, but their names are not remembered. Their names are not recorded here in this story. We have no idea who these people were. Whereas this other dude, Noah, who had no interest in this, his name is remembered because of his devotion to God. Then we get moving on down to verse 5. We kind of see the instigating action of this Noah story. The Lord saw the wickedness of humankind was great in the earth, and that every inclination of the thoughts of their hearts was only evil continually. So the words wickedness and evil come from the same root word, and they are used throughout the Bible in two different ways. They're in reference to harm done against others and harm done against God. So the combination of our violence against God and our violence against others kind of being thought of as basically the same thing. That when we do violence against others, we are doing violence against God, and vice versa. And again, an example of the reversal of God's intentions for creation. The word evil being the opposite of the word good, tov. God created the world and declared that it was good, but now humans are evil. Every inclination of the thoughts of their hearts was only evil continually. So it's the complete opposite of God's intentions for creation. Then we get this interesting word in verse 6, and I want to hear what you all have in your translations. Mine says, the Lord was sorry that he had made humankind on the earth. And another translation I looked at said, the Lord regretted creating. So I wonder, do you have similar words, or do you have anything other than sorry, regret?
Grieved.
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 God was sorry he'd made the human race in the first place. It broke his heart.
So I find that image interesting, almost as if God is repenting of God's own actions. God is sorry. God is grieved. God is regretful over what it is that was previously done. So I'm not entirely sure what to make of that. But I think that there is something to be said for the words that are used and the words that are not used. So again, thinking back to our Enuma Elish from the first week, and how much it's about violence, it's about anger, it's about hate, it's about selfishness. God is not angry when the people are wicked and don't live the way that God created them to live. God is not angry that they have reversed the good, the tov of the creation and turned it into wickedness and evil. God is instead sad. God grieves. God mourns. God is regretful. God is sorry. And so the idea that God chooses to be vulnerable in inviting us to participate in the creative act and in the nurturing of the creation. God kind of opens up to the possibility of being hurt when you love someone else, and you allow it to have its own feelings, own thoughts, own decisions. Then you are opening yourself up to being rejected, to having that thing that you love disappoint you. And so God knew that, and God chose to do it anyway. I wrote down an interesting set of ideas. It's not a direct quote, but an author named Walter Brueggemann, who is really smart and studies this kind of stuff, talked about how we should understand this sentence in terms of who God is. And he says that God's creative power is invitational and permissive, not coercive, not authoritarian. God wants humanity to be turned toward God in their thoughts and behavior. God desires that they be in right relationship with God, but God doesn't require it. God doesn't demand it. God doesn't use a big stick to require and force anyone to behave the way God wants us to behave. God brings the world to trust and obedience, not through force and fear, but through anguish and grief, and through God entering into the pain and brokenness of the world. And so I felt like that description of this sounded extremely familiar to me. What is the cross but God entering into the pain and brokenness of the world to share in our anguish and grief, to feel anguish and grief, and through that act to bring the world into relationship with God. Not because there's some kind of necessary sacrifice that must be made in order to atone for our sins, but because that's how God engages us. That's how God gets our attention. That's how God reaches out to us, not through fear, not through domination, but by sharing in our grief, by expressing that sadness, and by reaching out and asking us to join in relationship in that way. And so, Ben, I guess in a way, what you said about, God using violence to get our attention, I agree with that in a way, but I think that the violence that is done is not against us, it's against God. God experiences violence, and through experiencing that violence, through the anguish and the grief and the pain that God experiences, that is how God gets our attention. And hopefully we can see that and we can respond to it. So thoughts about that? I thought that was a really poignant, a really different way of understanding what this story is about, and in fact understanding, what God is all about.
Katie, do you have an example of what that looks like?
You mean today?
Yeah, like God experiencing that and thereby getting our attention.
Well, I might go so far as to get into a dangerous space and suggest that, where do we find God in the Bible? Where does Jesus spend his time? With the least and last and lost, with the people who are suffering. And so it is by being there with the person who is starving on the street, holding the sign on the street corner, being with the family that has lost their loved one to street violence or to police violence, that we are supposed to see God. And it's a hard thing because we're not just confronted with, with the wrongness of our world, with the troubles of how things are, but we're confronted with our own complicity in that, and not just against that individual person or group, but needing to realize that when a beloved child of God, no matter who it is, no matter what kind of value or valuelessness we place on that person, God loves that person and God grieves. God is in anguish to the same degree that that person is in anguish. So when we see on the news when someone, the mother or the wife or the child of someone who has been murdered through any kind of violence, is screaming and crying and shouting out, that isn't that person's voice. We are supposed to hear God's voice in that. And how are we supposed to react? How are we supposed to respond? And it's overwhelming. And I think a lot of us, and I include myself in this, a lot of us don't know how to handle that, don't know what to do when confronted with that kind of pain. That we are,
Okay.
yeah.
It's really big, but let's just say I'm a person that's really of a mindset that I just think that that's the person in pain's problem, not mine.
Mhm.
That they're suffering for good reason. And that line, I mean, then how is this speaking to me if I'm that person?
I think that's part of the wrong. I think that's part of the wrongness, right? Part of the
Yeah.
brokenness
Well, I
of
think so, but God's supposed to be speaking to everybody. So sometimes I just get stuck in this this spin of wondering, like, how do we come out of this?
Mhm.
How do we get the attention of this other group of people, or my brothers thinking this, or whatever, you know?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard. And you can't. I don't think you can make another human being see the humanity in someone else. I don't think you can make another human being, have compassion and see their own selfish behaviors and positions on things. I think you can show them. I think you can show them a different way by behaving in an opposite direction, and they might ridicule you for that, and just keep on going and not learn anything from it. But I think that there is. I think that's what this passage is saying. That's what this interpretation from Brueggemann is suggesting, that when there's always something, no matter who the person is, no matter how hard-hearted they are, no matter how the inwardly turned they are, there's always some spark of something in them that just needs to be found. And I think that is it. I always hate doing this because it's just such a cliche, but it's part of, I think, what is so scary when people watch the home movies that they found of Hitler that are even in color. And so they're pictures, they're videos of Adolf Hitler playing with dogs and smiling and laughing and running around. And there's no sound to them, but just the visuals, just the images of what we consider to be the ultimate evil in a human being that we have ever seen in recent history. Having humanity is shocking, because then we see ourselves in that person, and then we realize what we all are capable of. But then at the same time, we also realize that that person, that pure evil, is not even he was not pure evil. There was something in him, and that spark was not ignited because the people who surrounded him supported his hate, helped him to build that up, rather than trying to spark that spot of humanity, whatever it was, wherever it came from. So in terms of our responsibility to others, I think, we can't be the ones to change any hearts. Only God can change hearts. But what we can do is show a different way. While also, I would say, if it comes to, kind of personal relationships and close family members, making sure that we remember that it's not our job, it's God's job, it's God's mission. And yes, we can help, but we can't take on all of that on our own. We cannot allow ourselves to become overwhelmed and overworked and pushed to the limit because we're working so hard on this one person or this one group of people, because it's not ours. It's not our job to complete. It's God's job. We can do what we can to support it. But I don't think there aren't really easy answers to that kind of thing. The way that people view the world is not something that's easy to change. But what God knows and what we know, even from psychology, is force doesn't work. Force just makes people angrier. Force pushes people into the shadows and makes their positions more nefarious. Only love, only participation in what's wrong, experiencing the pain and suffering of the consequences of those actions alongside of people, even experiencing the pain that you experience when you have to confront your past and the way that you have hurt other people. I think people try to avoid suffering as much as they can. That's just natural. That's biology. And so if you see a problem in the world that you have been part of, your first inclination is to reject that. Of course not. I'm not part of that. That's not real. That's not true. So how do we overcome that? That's not something that we can overcome on our own. That's the work of God.
I have a question.
Yeah.
So in verse 6, and the Lord was sorry that he had made man on this earth and was grieved in his heart. And I always wonder about things like that. Doesn't God know what's going to happen? Doesn't he,
Mm-hmm.
sovereignty and so that, I mean, I have a lot of questions, why evil to begin with,
Right.
Why is it even here? We could have been much better off, but
Yeah. So my answer to that particular question would be, you're watching your toddler walk along the sidewalk too fast. You know that she's walking too fast, and you know that she's gonna fall. But maybe you say, well, she's got to learn that she's got limits right now for the speed that she can go. And you can say, hey, don't walk so fast. You're going to fall over. But then sometimes maybe you allow her to fall over and it hurts you. You don't want to see your child cry. You don't want to see your child hurt. You don't want to have to clean up the boo-boo. But maybe you allow it to happen. So maybe it's something like that.
Well, my thinking about the grieved, that the Lord was grieved, I look upon that as in the same light as I do that Jesus grieved for Jerusalem, what would happen to it. And there were good people in Jerusalem, not everybody was bad. And I think that was the grief that was shown, their own grief inside of them for what man had done. He gave us will, and we bastardized it really, and didn't hold up to what laws. I don't know. I don't find a place where the laws have been written down at this time, where they in the heart or where they were. But how did men know that the evils were there and that was evil? Or did man at that time think that, hey, this is okay, I'm a free individual, I can do what I want? That's part of what I look at there. And when I'm dealing with someone that is really emotionally upset, and that's what it is, it's an emotion, and you'll not change an emotion with either fact or discussion. I try to use an example from my life when I talk to them and say, I don't know what's going on, but this is how I handled a like situation in my own life. And I find sometimes that comforts. I've also heard, that, and I've always felt myself about all my suffering, and it has helped me with all the suffering I've had, was a saying that I'm not really suffering, I'm in training. Suffering for me is training. And that's really how I approach the grieved, that the Lord grieved over. Sadness, not in in what he had done, but what had happened to something that he had made. That's where I look at it.
Yeah, God's love for the creation and watching the suffering that is occurring.
Deteriorate, yeah.
Yeah.
Just like you do with your infant, or your child. If you see them going down the wrong path, you suffer right along with them, watching their deterioration. I feel that's the grief that God and Jesus felt.
Hmm. Any other thoughts? All right. Well, let's move on then down into a little bit of this other stuff. I've got a couple of notes here through the end of chapter 6. Let's see. So when we talked about, actually, let's go to chapter 7, verse 11. I think that is kind of the crux of the matter here for this stuff. So in verse 11, it says, in my translation, on the 600th year of Noah's life, in the second month, on the 17th day of the month, on that day, all the fountains of the great deep burst forth, and the windows of the heavens were opened. And so this is the description of what this, what we call a flood looks like. But if we look back to the creation story in chapter 1, and if you want, you can literally go there. It talks about that let there be a dome in the midst of the waters. Let it separate the waters from the waters. So God made the dome, and there were the waters under the dome, and there were the waters above the dome. So the understanding of how creation worked at this time, how how the world was formed, was that there were these waters at the top, and sometimes they leaked out, and that was rain. And then there were these waters at the bottom, and those were, the seas and the oceans and the rivers and the streams. Also the groundwater, if you dig down and find a well, the reason for that is because God is holding back those forces of chaos. Remember my favorite phrase, tohu vavohu, chaos and void. And so if creation exists because God is making that space within the chaos of the waters to create a space between the waters for creation to exist, then in order to uncreate, all God has to do is let go of those controls over those two waters and allow them to collapse back together, and everything goes straight back to how it was. And so it is the image of uncreation. It is the image of not just the destruction of life because of drowning, but the destruction of everything that God had created. Except, of course, for Noah and his family and his animals that got onto the boat. And so in this story, we're kind of have moved now. This is the first potential example of God being violent, and it goes back to that. What is violence, and do you have to intend to be violent in order for it to be violence, or do we just find violence in terms of the people being affected by the act? Obviously, all of creation, including Noah, would have experienced this kind of act as violent and terrifying and psychologically damaging, if not, physically damaging. But if we understand chaos, the act of uncreating, the act of undoing what God has made good, and violence, the act of attempting to undo what God is doing, the attempt to undo God's hierarchy and order of things, as the same thing, then it's not actually God who starts all of this. It's the humans. The humans are the ones who are uncreating. They're the ones who are destroying the creation, not God. And so really what happens here is not that God chooses to do this, but that God allows it to take run its full course. Okay, people, if this is how you are going to be, if this is what you are at the heart of it, then I am going to allow you to be there. If your intention is to undo my order, if your intention is to live outside of the bounds that I have created for you, then I will just take away the bounds. And here it is. Taking away the bounds means that all the chaos comes flooding back in. There's no more creation. Everything is gone. And it talks in several places about all flesh. And it's interesting because here, all flesh refers to everything. It refers to animals and plants and the trees and the mountains and everything. But in most other places in the Bible, the phrase all flesh actually only refers to humans when it talks about all flesh. And so why in this story does all flesh wrap up everything that's alive rather than just humans, where like it does in other places? And there's a suggestion in my book that the corruption of all of creation is on the humans. But because the humans were placed where they were in the order of things, they were supposed to nurture and take care of and help to co-create within the creation, that violence corrupted the rest of the creation to the point that any other kind of life was also corrupted. And so this story could actually be read as a reminder of the responsibility that we as humans have and were given in the creation story to rule over and take care of the creation. What happens to us impacts what happens to the creation. When we make decisions about ourselves, we're not just making decisions for us. We are making life and death decisions for everything that exists, for all the world, for all the animals and plants and rocks and trees and molecules and oxygen and everything else that exists that God has
That's our
given us.
stewardship, right?
So it goes back to stewardship, that our violence, our decisions to step out of our place in the created order, our decisions to behave in ways that are inward turned, that are selfish, that are sinful, are not just doing violence to ourselves and to other humans, but are doing violence to the creation that relies on us to make decisions that are in the best interest of the creation, to care for the creation, to and I think I know this is somehow up for debate these days, but I think that we're seeing that truth right in our faces in many ways right now, with the insane fires that we get that are bigger and bigger every year, and the more the more hurricanes, and the random, I never heard of a derecho or however you say it before it hit Iowa, and it wasn't even in the news because there was so much other stuff going on in the world that overshadowed that insane weather pattern. 2 hurricanes at once in the Gulf. That's I'm only 36 years old. I'm getting a little tired of once in a lifetime weather experiences already.
Every year.
Yes. So why is that? I think it's it's thousands of years of the violence that humans have done to the earth because of their refusal to be the people that God created them to be, to fit into the created order the way that they're supposed to, because they don't want to be satisfied with who God created them to be. They want more. They want to be God. They want to overturn God's authority and live on their own authority, make a name for themselves rather than allow God to name them. and claim them. So any thoughts on any of that on chapter 7?
Oh, I've often wondered why the mosquitoes were saved. And, it's kind of like there's a lot of things that don't really make sense with that. I mean, I don't know. But I appreciate what you said about God's voice being in the anguish and the pain. And so maybe that touches some hearts in ways that we don't understand because we're already there.
Mm.
But maybe there's a special frequency or something that can hit some people because of that. I don't know.
Mm-hmm. And
I don't know what I'm saying.
No, and that's
Just
where
talking.
that's where prayer comes in. That's where trust in the Holy Spirit comes in. That's where remembering where we belong in the order of things comes in. That yes, we desperately wish that all people, including ourselves, when we're honest with ourselves, would just shape up and get it together and stop acting like this. And we want to do everything that we can to make that happen. But God understands in a way that we can never understand, that you can't force someone to behave in the way that you want them to behave. You can't make someone do it. You have to reach them. And God knows, God knows what that frequency is, if I can use your metaphor. God knows how to reach the people. So to me, the frustrating part is, why isn't God doing it? But I think then that brings me right back to Job. Well, where were you when I was forming the earth? You are not me. You don't get to ask those questions. You don't get to make those challenges. You don't get to decide how things will be and when and why.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, well, let's move on to chapter 8. And most of this is pretty familiar with the boat and the water and sending the dove and all this kind of stuff. So I want to look specifically at verses 20 through 22, and I want to actually read this because I think this is the crux of the whole thing. So for my version, this is chapter 8, verses 20 through 22. Then Noah built an altar to the Lord, and took of every clean animal and of every clean bird, and offered burnt offerings on the altar. And when the Lord smelled the pleasing odor, the Lord said in his heart, I will never again curse the ground because of humankind, for the inclination of the human heart is evil from youth, nor will I ever again destroy every living creature as I have done. As long as the earth endures, seed time and harvest, cold and heat, summer and winter, day and night shall not cease. So my first question here is, why did Noah make this sacrifice? And if you look immediately before it, it just shows Noah and his sons and wives and the animals coming out of the ark. So it's not that God asked him to do this. He's not sacrificing in atonement. He's not trying to make up for some, evil actions of his own or anyone else's. God did not demand this sacrifice of him. Like Ben mentioned, none of the laws had been established at this point in the story, in the narrative. And so we can't expect Noah to be, understanding that you make a sacrifice of a certain type of animal under certain circumstances, because none of that existed at this point in the narrative. So why does he do this? I think that the reason that he does this is just to say thank you, to show God his appreciation for God's choice to save him, to not allow him to be destroyed, and to return the creation after the chaos. You get the notification there. If you look right back at the beginning of chapter 8, it says, God remembered Noah and all the wild animals and domestic animals, and God made a wind blow over the earth, and the waters subsided. The fountains of the deep and the windows of the heavens were closed. The rain from the heavens was restrained, and the waters gradually receded from the earth. So that is the exact same thing that happens in the creation story. The wind of God blows over the earth. The Spirit of God hovers over the waters, and God divides the waters and puts some in the dome in the sky and some in the fountains of the deep. And so this is God recreating, reestablishing what had been created and then destroyed and now recreated. And so I think this sacrifice is just God, Noah thanking God, reaching out to God to acknowledge that God didn't have to do this, but God chose to. So then we get to verse 21, and it says that God decided not to do this again. And in my translation, I don't really like my translation of this as much as others. It says, I will never again curse the ground because of humankind, for the inclination of the human heart is evil from youth. That use of the word for seems to indicate a causal relationship, but it doesn't make any sense. It's almost like the two thoughts are in conflict with each other. I will never again curse the ground because of humankind, because the inclination of the human heart is evil. No, that doesn't make any sense. And the Hebrew here is has some wiggle room for what you might use. So I don't know if any of you have this, but I would prefer to use even though or despite there. God says, I will never again curse the ground because of humankind, even though the inclination of the human heart is evil from you. The God choosing to never do this again despite the change. Kind of the recognition that the flood hasn't changed humans at all. This uncreation and recreation has not changed how the humans behave, who they are in their heart of hearts, the evil that resides within them, the selfishness, the desire to live outside of their space in the created order and do the job that God created them to do. None of that has changed. But what has changed because of this experience is God. God has changed. God has decided not to give the world what it deserves ever again.
Well, this one's close.
What's that?
This one's closer. It says, I'll never again curse the ground because of people. I know they have this bent toward evil from an early age, but I'll never again kill off every living thing as I've just done.
Yeah, I think that's better. So as a former Presbyterian, a recovering Presbyterian perhaps, my buddy John Calvin has a commentary on this story, and he said that we should feel glad. We should all be sacrificing to God every day and thanking God every day, as Noah does in verse 20, because, and he says, there would be a necessity for a daily deluge if we got what we deserved. That every single day God would uncreate because of who we are fundamentally at heart and what we do to destroy and undermine what it is that God has created.
But you know what? It would take away the confusion of who's right and who's wrong. So.
Another interesting thought from this little section 20 to 22. It talks about cursing the ground, and there's no curse in this Noah story. There's no, God doesn't say I'm going to curse the ground, but where did God curse the ground? In chapter 3. So there's an understanding that the hard labor that Adam had to undergo to try to get what he needed from the ground, and then Cain is cursed from the ground and can't get anything to grow, and so he's forced to wander and create the city and can no longer be a farmer. the interpretation is that here God is reintroducing the opportunity to be co-tenders of God's vineyard, so to speak. That when Adam and Cain were around, after the cursing of the ground, that was a removal of that opportunity to work alongside God as stewards of the garden of the creation. But now God is reintroducing this opportunity. God is giving humanity a second chance, even though we've done nothing to earn that renewed trust, even though we've done nothing to earn that gift of the return of what was taken away. God has decided to return it. So any thoughts on chapter 8?
Yeah, this is the first time I really noticed that bird came back with a fresh leaf. I just never really thought about it before. And I was thinking, if everything had been like killed off, that would be kind of miraculous to find a fresh leaf.
Mm-hmm.
So it's the symbolism is big, but the reality is not. So.
But my book says it was a raven,
Mm.
and I've never seen that before. There was a raven instead of a dove.
It sent out both in mine.
Oh, really?
The raven went first, and the dove was the one that came back with the leaf later. Yeah. I didn't know about the raven either. So.
Yeah, so that's kind of part of the confusion of the two stories. One story has the raven and then the dove. The other story has the dove going out and then coming back, and then the dove going out and coming back again. And then finally going out and not coming back, or coming back with the olive leaf. So
Yeah.
either way, it's, hey, I guess there must be something out there now that God has created for this thing to roost on and live by. Otherwise it would have come back, because we're the only thing that exists out there.
I don't think we can take this as a time frame on a day-by-day basis, because if we do, then one of the things that always enters into my mind is Noah walks out of the ark, and then he gives these sacrifices of birds. Well, he's only got 2 of each kind, and if he sacrifices 2 birds, that's the loss of a species. So I think there's some time frame in there that might have been reproduction, if you will, or something like that before that. I just don't think we can do that on a day-by-day basis, and that's why I think that the time frame also, when they were in the ark and they thought everything was okay, and the bird came back with the leaf, I think that was the regrowth, not something that the regrowth that was occurring out there.
Mm. So yeah, interesting. And I agree with you that the time frames aren't necessarily to be taken literally. In fact, I don't think this whole story should be taken literally necessarily, because the purpose of the story isn't to tell us a history, it's to explain to us something about the phenomena around us that we observe as humans and try to understand. And we're going to get into that question in just a minute. But if you look back, our children's books always talk about the 2x2, and there are 2 of every animal. But the Priestley writer actually, at the very beginning of chapter 7, says, go into the ark, you and all your household, for I have seen that you alone are righteous before me in this generation. Take with you 7 pairs of all clean animals, the male and its mate, and a pair of the animals that are not clean, the male and its mate, and 7 pairs of the birds of the air, to keep their kind alive on the face of the earth. So interesting, because that version of the story, the Priestley version, talks about 7 of some things and 2 of other things. But the other version is the one where everything is just 2x2. In the very next paragraph, at verse 8, of clean animals and of animals that are not clean, and of birds and of everything that creeps on the ground, 2 and 2, male and female, went into the ark with Noah. And so those are 2 different versions of what God's instructions were, one from the Priestley writer and one from the Yahwist writer. But an interesting take.
And then it's interesting how I mean, I believe what you're saying, but it's interesting how they specified the first day of this particular month and the first day of that particular month and the number of days. So the specificity combined with the lack of saying is kind of an interesting overlay.
Yeah, and the timelines, most of the time frame references are from the priestly writer, because again, the priestly writer is trying to reestablish for the Jewish people how to order their lives in a ritualized way, how to follow the religion of God and why it's important to follow it. But when you look at some of the time frames that are given by the Yahwist, they conflict with what the priestly writer is saying. But does that matter? It doesn't matter to me. I don't care. I don't care if it was 150 days or 40 days or what. The point for me is the reason why this story is told. And I think that we tend to just assume that this story is told as, you know, maybe an interesting historical anomaly, or perhaps even as a threat. But what kind of threat is it if we hear this story about how God destroyed everything, but at the very end of the story it says, don't worry, God's never going to do this again? Doesn't really work out very well. And so I think that the purpose of this story is not to tell us why God destroyed the world at that one time, but to explain why God allows us to continue to exist as we are now. Why are we allowed to continue on despite how bad things are? I ask that question all the time. How can I believe in a good God when things are just so bad? Why doesn't God just destroy it all? Wouldn't it be better if none of us existed than to have all this suffering and pain and treating each other the way that we do? And the answer to that question is this story, that God tried that and it didn't work. And so God decided to change tactics. God decided to be more patient, more gracious, rather than try to change us, because God knew that this is who we are at the heart of it. And so that question that we're all asking all the time, the answer is right here in our Bible. We just haven't been reading this story from the right perspective. I've been too busy reading this story from the perspective of the threat, or from the perspective of well, it's in there, I just assume it's in there. I don't really think about why or what it's trying to get at. But if we think of it as not telling us why the world was almost destroyed, but why the world is not destroyed now, that makes a lot of sense. If this section of the Bible from Genesis 1 to Genesis 11 is about that myth, is about answering those big questions about why do we exist and what is our purpose and why are there stars in the sky and why are we allowed to continue to exist when we're such terrible people, that question is answered by this story. Okay, so last section here, looking at chapter 9, verses 1 to 16. This is where God establishes the covenant with Noah. And so he talks about how he wants them to be fruitful and multiply and repopulate the earth, and all the animals are supposed to repopulate the earth and all this kind of thing. And then it says, every moving thing that lives shall be food for you, and just as I gave you the green plants, I give you everything. So some scholars believe that this is the advent of carnivorism or omnivorism, if that's a word, for humans. That before this, we were only supposed to be eating the vegetables and the fruits and the plants, but not the animals. But now we're allowed to do this violence to other mammals, to other animals, and to eat them. But God still places limits around this violence. We're only allowed to eat the flesh, not the blood. The flesh of the animal is allowed, but the blood represents life, and life needs to be sanctified. Life needs to be protected. Life needs to be understood as holy and separated away from the everyday. And then again, another limitation. I know that you violent creatures are going to continue to be violent, but another prohibition. Your own lifeblood I will surely require a reckoning from every animal. I will require it and from human beings. Whoever sheds the blood of a human, by a human shall this person's blood be shed. For in his own image God made humankind. So total prohibition against the shedding of human blood. The image of God resides in every human being, and therefore the life that God breathes into each of us is holy and cannot be taken away. And this is pretty, this is pretty stark. When we get later into some of the laws and talking about, stoning your wife to death if she's caught in adultery and things like that, that is a violation of this law. But if we're talking about, where the formation of laws, well, the first law was don't eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Well, we broke that law. And now we've got these two new laws. Don't eat the blood of an animal, and do not shed the blood of a human. It doesn't say don't shed the blood of a human unless they hurt you or you're doing it in self-defense. It doesn't say don't shed the blood of a human unless they did something really bad and you as a society decide that they need to die for it. It just says do not shed the blood of a human. So I find that very interesting that, that's kind of where we start with all of this. And then as things progress, it gets more and more nuanced. And which one of those laws is the one that's actually supposed to be followed? Is God making concessions for us when we get into the deeper and more complex laws because we can't manage to follow these simple ones? All right, so that's what I've got for today. Any questions, comments, disagreements, arguments?
So Katie, how
Yeah.
do you put that together with, wait, let me go back. I'm finding it. Okay. Whoever sheds human blood, by humans let his blood be shed.
Yeah, interesting. So
I
the
really
very
like
act
where
of,
you're going.
yeah.
But-
Yeah, so we're not allowed to kill other people, but a human will kill you if you kill someone. But is that
opens it up, right?
the person deciding to do it, or is that God using a human as the instrument to do it? I don't
Does
know.
it make a difference?
I don't know. Because then I think that if we read this and we say, well, if you kill someone, then we get to kill you, that's us deciding that we are going to, again, step out of our place in the order of creation and get to play the judge for ourselves rather than allowing God to be the judge.
I don't know.
But yeah, that is a challenge.
So is it better not living 950 years?
I think so. I hope this one brought at least a little bit more resolution for you than typically. I think, having worked through this for myself and coming to that conclusion that this story is not a threat from God. This is not a story of God saying, well, I guess, this isn't working out, so I don't really care about this creation. I don't want to be involved in it anymore. I'm going to destroy it, and then trying to start over. But this is an explanation of why is it like this? Why do we live in this world that's so bad, so challenging, so difficult, has so much evil and suffering in it? And the reason for that is because God has chosen and has committed to and has promised to have endless patience, to have endless grace, to continue to work with us rather than destroy us. So I don't know that that's, too much of a comfort from day to day when we're watching the news and seeing all the terrible things that are going on in our world, but there it is.
I'm just thinking. That's why I'm not talking. I'm
Nope,
trying
that's all
to.
right. That's all right.
My brain's going like that.
Trying to get our attention.
I think you're right, Ben. I think you're right.
I can't explain it. It was just what he said, someone said, and every even individual sorrows. We can't explain it. We don't know why, but there's got to be some good in it because God is good, and that's basically the way I look at it. If I looked at it in a legalistic, total way, it would really harm my faith, and I don't believe that's the purpose of the Bible and Jesus. Um, it's more of a loving thing, and he's trying to get my attention. I'm not in sorrow, but I'm in training, and I try to look upon everything as that, and let him guide my life. That's about the only way I can exist. To be very candid with you.
Yeah, I am wrestling with, I am balking as you talk at the idea that God is causing the suffering. I believe that God can use suffering.
No.
That God can use suffering that happens because of our human actions or others' actions against us.
No, I agree with you, Katie. I didn't mean to instill that God is doing all this stuff, but in the way that God allowed Job to be tested by the devil, when the devil said, he's faithful to you because he's doing pretty good. Let me have a crack at him and see if I can break him. And the same way God allowed the devil to tempt Jesus in the desert, and that's basically what I know, that God is not doing this himself. We are doing this to ourselves because of our sin. That's basically.
I think that's that little passage about the grief and the sorrow and the sadness in chapter 6, speaks to that in some way, that it's suffering exists not because God causes it, but because we cause it. We are the source of our own violence, as a species, as a people together. But where is it that we find God? We find God entering into that anguish. We find God entering into that suffering. And so, yeah, God can get our attention and does get our attention in that way. That when we look at suffering, when we see disaster, we ask why, where instead we should be asking, where do I see God here? How can I connect with God through this? Not that because God is making it happen, not because God desires that it happen, but because we know that God has promised to be present there. And so we know that we can find God if we have the eyes to see.
Yeah, I could share. I worked in the field of drug abuse prevention for a long time, and I taught classes out at Simpson for new teachers on the topic. And one of the things that became really clear is that the drug use in the 60s that became such a problem, that studying the causes of addiction led to a lot of medications today that help people with mental illness. And we wouldn't have understood how the brain adapted to that stress. God has everything in our brain that we need, and it can produce its own endorphins and other things like that. But we wouldn't have known that if they hadn't been studying the addiction, and they wouldn't have been studying that if it hadn't been such a horrible situation. So it's a convoluted way, and you can't always see the end, but God can work it for good if you look, like you said, if you have the eyes to see.
Yeah, I always try to find a glimmer of light in the darkness. I've heard it said that way, that if you can find that point of light in the darkness of grief and the world itself, then build on that point of light for your own life.
Yeah. And then it becomes, I think, a matter of making sure that you maintain the correct relationship among those things. That God doesn't create the darkness just so that you can look for the light, but the darkness is already there because we are there, because we are, as this says, evil from our youth. But God has promised that in all the darknesses that we experience, there is a light.
There is a light. Yes.
All right. Well, I think that's a good enough word for today to wrap it up on. Anybody else have any closing thoughts today? All right. Well, thanks for another really good and challenging conversation today. We will be back next week.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Have a good week.
Thanks, Katie. Thanks, guys.